Margaret Cohen, who is a professor of English and comparative literature at Stanford University. She is known to us at least since, what's the date of your profane illuminations? 1993. Yeah. Margaret really is has been a critical sort of reference for us in our thinking about Phantasmagoria. She's a literary critic, literary historian, writing about English, French literature, and now has moved on to other subjects. And she will today talk to us about the Gothic imagination, from the castle, the dungeon or whatever, the haunted spaces of that time, to a very special category of spaces, contemporary spaces, mediated sort of spaces. So, Margaret, welcome.
So, thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you, Libro and Nadir. It's just a great pleasure and just very gratifying to know that my work has reached beyond my discipline and has been able to speak to people across disciplines. And, you know, I think as an academic, that's really the great reward of our writing. So I'm really honored to be here today. I thought, I think interdisciplinary inquiry is such a difficult thing, and sometimes it's very productive to really give a taste of the texture of a discipline. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Gothic novels, which are the prehistory of the Phantasmagoria, and actually make some direct connections between the Gothic and Robertson spectacle. And I'm going to do it as a literary critic, and with a kind of grittiness of our kind of analysis. And then I'm going to move after that to something which I'm currently working on, which is how people have imagined the underwater environment based on modern technologies that enable its access and representation, which produce their own kinds of phantasmagorias. And I hope that throwing the oceans into the mix maybe will enrich our conversation about modernity today. Let me start then with the past. When Robertson invented the magic lantern spectacle of the Phantasmagoria in the 1790s, he was steeped in a Gothic sensibility that really was the popular imaginative mode of the era. The Gothic sensibility is not synonymous with Gothic architecture. I think it's important to say here. It dates to a novel from 1764 by Horace Walpole, an English intellectual, The Castle of Otranto. But there is a connection to Gothic architecture. Walpole was a proponent of the Gothic revival in the middle of the 18th century. And from the 1750s to the 1780s, he renovated his summer villa called Strawberry Hill in Gothic revival style. And there's actually the Walpole Archives are at Yale University, and there's a wonderful catalog about all the renovations and how he imported the Gothic. In his fiction, he used medieval architecture to organize a tale of a sinister feudal past filled with dark family histories of passion, murder, and revenge. And across the Gothic genre, features of the plot that create suspense are melodramatic characters facing choices that make you face choices between good and evil, kinds of cliffhangers and thrills, and architecture within the Gothic as a form of imagination is very important in generating suspense and thrills, and very specific kinds of architectural structure: castles, forts, dungeons, churches, cloisters, and monasteries. And when these feudal spaces return in the Enlightenment, they are a way to express the regressive, the irrational, the continuing power in the presence of a kind of atavistic violence and a regime ruled by force. So you have to think of the Gothic revival and the Enlightenment as existing at the same historical moment. So at the time that Robertson invented the Phantasmagoria, the Gothic was the most popular novel of the time, and this is a point that I'm not the first to have made. Terry Castle makes it, and many others. And I just wanted to show you an example from Robertson's Phantasmagoria, which is on the right. This is the apparition, I believe, of a figure called the Bleeding Nun, who is at the center of a novel called The Monk by Matthew Lewis from 1796, so just a year before the Phantasmagoria is invented, which has a ghost of a nun who committed all kinds of lustful, erotic, and violent acts who returns to haunt the novel. It actually was translated by Artaud. It was a novel that was beloved by the Surrealists. I also think, just want to stress here in making the connection between the Gothic and the literary imagination and then into the Phantasmagoria, that one of the characteristics of the Phantasmagoria is to project the figures from behind, where the magic lantern is behind the screen, so that the apparatus is hidden. And in that way, the bleeding nun seems to emerge to your imagination as if it were kind of popping off the pages of a novel, unmediated by technology. Okay, so this is the part where I'm just going to do a little bit of gritty textual analysis to show you how the Gothic use of setting cultivates the kind of receptiveness in the audience that the Phantasmagoria also thrives on. In fact, Terry Castle has described the Phantasmagoria as a Gothic extravaganza complete with fashionable Radcliffean decor. Do you know what Radcliffean decor is? Good. So, okay, good. So Anne Radcliffe, the British author Anne Radcliffe, is a recognized mistress of the Gothic, and her novels, like The Italian and The Mysteries of Udolpho, memorably etched in the consciousness of an era a sense of menace and anxiety. And one of the great motors of this menace and anxiety was characters' navigation through grim feudal spaces. So I'm going to give you an example in this long passage of how these constructions from the past create in the mind of the beholder the uncertainty, the apprehension, the receptivity, and the suspension of critical faculties and reason essential to phantasmagorical illusion. So the beholder in the example I've chosen is the novel's protagonist. She's a genteel, well brought up, but unfortunately an orphan young woman named Emily St. Aubert. She falls prey to a scheming Italian count, the Count Montoni, who's married her aunt and wants to rob her of her inheritance and perhaps of her virtue. She's been carried off to a remote castle in the Apennines. She's been imprisoned, and she wants to find her aunt, and so she has to interact with Barnardine, who is the servant of the Count and has kind of dubious aims in regards to her anyway. And so I've just given you an excerpt. I don't know, can you read it from here, from where you're sitting? No, unfortunately. Okay, so terrible. So I'm just going to quote to you. It's a useless slide. She is taken to see her aunt in a promenade through a castle. And she's taken through corridors and passages which really close in on her in her walk. And they block her vision. So I'm just going to read a little bit then, since you can't see anything. They go into the castle courtyard. From the steps, they proceeded through a passage adjoining the vaults of the walls of which were dropping with unwholesome dews. So vaults, as you know, can have two meanings. They can either be soaring ceilings, as in Gothic architecture, creating an expansive sense of air and room, or they can be chambers, subterranean passages where you have mysteries buried, the dead, coffins, and it's in that sense that these vaults are used. They go through medieval fortifications and a castle whose stones are, quote, rough and black with age. And this castle is not a gracious castle like the chateau of the Renaissance. It's a medieval fortification with heavy buttresses, and these are all words from the text that is illegible. Narrow grate, massy iron gates, postern door. And then they go through winding staircases, where the wind is whistling through narrow cavities that accentuate the desolation of the place. So this castle becomes like a breathing reminder of the feudal regime with the wind whistling through it. Emily notices on the walls a suit of ancient armor with an iron visor. And the narrator suggests that this armor is perhaps a trophy of victory. The helmet is an interesting figure. In fact, the castle of Otranto starts with a huge helmet, like way beyond a human scale, crashing from the sky right into the courtyard of a building. The helmet is a form of headgear which blocks your ability to see who's looking at you, so it creates a sense of being looked at without the ability to return the gaze. And Emily finally gets to like a chamber where the only thing in it is an iron chair. And it's not an iron throne. It's got iron bars and rings to inflict torture. And so, overcome by the anxiety from this walk, she momentarily collapses onto this chair. So there's this unconscious attraction to precisely the instrument of torture. And when she starts, and then she realizes that where she is, and she kind of pulls back. And then there's a recess in the room. And with a black curtain on it. And recesses are another source of menace and anxiety in this chamber, which should be masterable through your gaze, which should be legible, but which the Gothic it likes to block visibility and block access through vision. And she pulls back the curtain, and she's so perturbed and overcome by this winding, disorienting walk through narrow passages and corridors, and with the spectacle of armor and the torture chamber, that she sees what she thinks is a dead body, and she just faints in horror and terror. Later, you will learn at the very end of the novel that this is a statue that Emily has mistaken in the kind of phantasmagorical state which has been induced by her promenade. And in some novels, so Emily's state of mind that's induced by her promenade is uncertain. There's uncertainty and fear. And in some novels, like The Castle of Otranto, this mixture of curiosity, fear, and uncertainty is justified by the violence of the events. It's just murder after murder. In Udolpho, though, and I think this is important for the Phantasmagoria, it's more of a thick, lurid atmosphere. It creates a kind of wavering imagination that the Romantics would call phantasmagorical. And there's a lot of lighting in the passage that I had up on the screen. There's haze and vapors. There are feeble rays that are flickering from a lamp. And Radcliffe uses a very interesting term, uncertain flashes of light from a torch. So you kind of get a glimpse and then something disappears. And the uncertainty then is both in what is illuminated and in the kind of viewer's mind about just the uncertainty of what they're seeing. And I think there are kind of two readings you can give of this spectacle of the feudal past and its violence in the Gothic novel. One is very optimistic. We're in a new time. I don't know if any of you have read Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, but she has a demystification of like all this fear about the past. You know, we live in a time when such things are no longer possible. So an ode to the Enlightenment. But I think since the novel spends so much time, and since Gothic novels in general, establishing this lurid atmosphere of potential menace, that you kind of ignore what's really the most interesting thing about the genre if you read it that way. And I think another explanation is that it's a way to acknowledge the continued violence that lurks in the shadows of modernity, which is hidden or perhaps internalized by the subject. This was for the uncertain flashes of lighting, that you can see the Gothic spectacle, Robertson's Phantasmagoria. It's got the smoke coming out of the urns. It's got the lighting that shows you the demons that were projected on the screens from behind. So that's actually important translation from the historical Gothic novel to the origins of phantasmagorical spectacle. But I think, we would oppose this dark, feudal kind of imagination with the light and transparency of the panopticon. It would seem at the farthest remove from heavy buttresses and narrow grate and massy iron gates. But this sense of wavering uncertainty and and this interiorization of surveillance that Foucault talks about may actually have some parallels and some interface. And perhaps the Gothic dresses up in medieval garb a new form of disciplinary power and displays it as entertainment. So it takes a kind of relish or enjoyment in it. Robertson's Phantasmagoria used the architecture of the Gothic in getting audiences into the receptive state of mind that would make them best appreciate and enjoy its pleasures. So I'm just quoting from Tom Gunning, a historian of cinema, as he describes the setting of Robertson's Phantasmagoria in a former cloister shut down by the Revolution and refunctioned as an entertainment venue. He says, one approached the entrance to Robertson's Phantasmagoria picking one's way past the crumbling walls of the convent and among the gravestones of deceased nuns. So one motivation for Robertson's choice of locale may have been cheap rent, but he soon incorporated the former convent and its association into his spectacle. So the approach and prelude it offered to the actual Phantasmagoria performance played an essential role in the total effect of the exhibition. After one has moved through the court of the Capucines in the evening twilight and entered the former cloister, one walked down a long corridor which Robertson trained as a painter as well as a scientist, decorated with dark and fantastic paintings. So you can see there's really the use of the circulation through this very kind of spooky space to get you ready to see this spectacle. The Gothic novel originated in the British Isles, and a taste for the form spread across the continent and indeed across the globe by the turn of the 19th century. This has been a powerful thread through modern literature and other forms of entertainment as well. In the novel and short story, Gothic writers show a preference for claustrophobic spaces that block panoramic vision and torturous itineraries through grim environs, but the nature of these environs changes. So in the urban Gothic, for example, the City's Mysteries novel, which proliferates in the 19th century, it's the dark spaces of the city, the spaces which are haunted by the criminal classes, by the dispossessed, which become the venues for the Gothic imagination. In the Southern Gothic, it's the ruins of the plantation system, which are the a site that elicit the ghosts of the past. And then I think, interestingly, starting about the 1950s or 60s, there's a kind of suburban Gothic in the U.S. where the menace shifts to the banal facade of an inexpressive present. So you get different kinds of aesthetic tones. You know, the original Gothic is like hot, to use the kind of McLuhan Baudrillard term. It's got fire and blood and candle wax. And I just put up this image, which I thank one of my graduate students, Sarah Naftalis, for, by the photographer Gregory Crewdson, to give you a sense of the cool Gothic, you know, the suburban Gothic amidst the banal, you know, trappings of suburban life, this not cruel transmutation, I think resonates with Libero and Nadir's interest in phantasmagoria that are mediated by contemporary architecture and virtual forms of expression and their anesthetics, this kind of narcotic of reality, to cite them. So in lieu of an ending, I want to share with you a glimpse of my current research, which concerns how the modern imagination of the underwater environment is shaped by technologies for its access and technologies enabling its exhibition on land. And I think it's a version, some of the scenes that you see under the sea can be related to the phantasmagorical imagination, and they're kind of a cool Gothic, but they're cold, because it's very cold down there. And so I just wanted to show you this. The moment I'm going to look at is the moment of the invention of the realistic ability to film underwater in the middle of the 20th century. And one of the things that fascinated the very first innovators like Cousteau were the vista of wreckage on the seafloor. So Cousteau's second film, his first film was called 18 Meters Deep. The second film, and so he's inventing the technology for scuba, he's inventing the technology for underwater photography, and I could tell you why that's so difficult, is about wrecks. So I just want to show you a passage from Wrecks, which I think really makes the tie between earlier Gothic and Gothic of our times. And you're going to hear French, and its translation is roughly, for the person who glides with effort, so you're going to be looking at the remains of a shipwreck, for the person who glides with effort over these decks covered with moss, nothing is wood, copper, or iron. There are no more objects. However, this old worm-eaten rust was once the polished oaken steering, and then I couldn't make out the word. It's either a carbonateur or a calgoneur, I can't quite tell, so either a carburetor or cargo ship. So this old worm-eaten rust was once the polished oaken steering of a cargo ship. An old helmsman took a hold of it for its first launch, and this tube was a cannon. The wheel to aim it still turns. So let me just show you that clip.
Pour qui plane sans effort sur ces ponts couverts de mousse, rien n'est bois, cuivre ou fer. Il n'y a plus d'objet. Pourtant, cette vieille roue vermoulue était autrefois la barre en chêne ciré d'un cargo neuf. Un vieux timonier l'a prise en main avec orgueil pour son premier appareillage. Et ce tube, c'était un canon. Le volant de pointage tourne encore.
Okay. So, as you can see, the shipwreck here has become an opportunity to exhibit the ruins of technology. A vehicle that was once a propeller of modern transport is now a grave, a ruin, an assemblage, where underwater life is colonized man-made construction into a kind of artificial reef. And the underwater Gothic thus is fascinated with the ruins of modernity and differs from the Gothic novel I was previously describing. But at the same time, there's one more turn of the screw, because the technology permitting divers to access these wrecks, let alone film them, is integral to the modernity that the images simultaneously show subject to disintegration. So Cousteau was pioneering scuba and underwater film in this as he was making the film. And when oceanographer Robert Ballard discovered the wreck of the RMS Titanic in 1985, he was also using a state-of-the-art vehicle. This was the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute's innovative deep-sea submersible Alvin, and he was also assisted by Russian Mir submersibles, which provided the strong lighting that was needed to illuminate the darkness at such great depths. And I'm sure, of course, you're familiar with the wreckage of the Titanic from Cameron's film from 1997, which opens with the actual footage of the wreck, which required, again, very innovative technology. So, for example, the pressure down there, pressure at the surface is 1 atmosphere. The pressure at the level of the wreck where the Titanic lies is 400 atmospheres. So Cameron needed to design cameras that were capable of withstanding 400 atmospheres of pressure, and humans couldn't get into the interstices of the wreck, so he used a remotely operated vehicle, this is Snoop Dogg, which was able to give him a view into the wreckage of the time. And I'm interested, and I don't quite have a handle on the voyeuristic entertainment in shipwrecks, which has an unstable valence, so they illustrate the expansion of the realm of technology into extreme, almost alien environments that are at the same time part of our planet. And the fragility of the technologies that are used as a human support across the seas. And so, yeah, I use the term assemblage, but I'm not sure about the affect, this alien life, strange ruins, a chill of the grave, the hypermodernity of the technologies to access them. And I read an article by Cameron, so this is what Snoop Dogg, allows you to see, for example, the promenade, and I just thought you'd be interested to compare it to what the promenade looked like when it actually was used on the Titanic's first voyage. And I was just really surprised to find the language of the Gothic and the Phantasmagoria that Cameron, rather unselfconsciously, is using in an article that he wrote, that he speaks in, called "Ghost Walking in Titanic," talking about how he spent more time in the ship than its captain, Captain Smith, in examining the wreckage. He also talks about what it's like to do it through the mediation of what he calls his ROV avatar. So it's interesting to think of the avatar as actually having a connection to the underwater prostheses to move the human senses into spaces where they can't exist without some sort of aid. And he likens exploring the wreck to a strange out-of-body experience of ghost walking. And now I'm quoting Cameron, "Its Gothic ruin exists now in ghostly limbo, neither in our world nor completely gone from it. The rusticals have transformed Edwardian elegance into a phantasmagorical cavern, a surreal underworld ruled only by dream logic." In short, Cameron's comments suggest that remotely operated vehicles procure an out-of-body access to a realm beyond human physiology, which can't just be described in kind of factual terms. It's a how we evaluate technology in this context, I think, is a complicated issue, and I just sort of raise it as a question. It's not only a source of illusionism. We need it to access a reality of an environment that's generative of aesthetics, and that also sustains life on our planet, and is, at the moment, really very political in the sense that it's being affected by climate change. So I just put up as my last slide an image of a scientist at the University of Sydney, Maria Burns, who is studying a massive coral bleaching event on the Great Barrier Reef that happened in 2016. She just published an article in the journal Nature on this subject to kind of give you a sense of this interface of human destructiveness that is affecting, the underwater environment, and yet the need for these technologies to be able to access them, and the kind of question about what sort of a dream space is the underwater environment in our modernity.
We should use microphone in the device.
Katie.
Maybe
She has a head.
you have targets.
What if it's somebody else?
You're not recording this. Oh, she needs the microphone for recording.
Oh.
Do we have time for
Yeah, she's fine.
a couple of questions, or?
Maybe one or two questions.
Yeah, 1 or 2 questions?
I want to ask the kid, from your illustration of some romantic on Titanic or some torture, or some chamber, or some very religious churches, can you just, our picture very obvious, but can some readers can infer more potential information from these pictures or illustrations?
More potential information in the sense of about how torture was actually conducted, or?
For example, churches is,
Right.
it's obviously is religious. Can you just observe some arts elements from behind this picture? Yeah, infer or just obvious.
I guess I'm not quite sure what your question, I'm sorry, just,
For example, a church, right? Church
Right.
should be about religious, no doubts.
Right.
Sometimes we combine arts with religious.
Yes.
Maybe some very more smarter, very more intelligent readers, you can see some arts elements. Based on
in the
that.
churches, yes.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
so a great novel for that would be Victor Hugo's Notre Dame, which is about the church as a source of a kind of a Gesamtkunstwerk, a source of medieval obscurantism, a kind of phantasmagorical space, a space of torture, and a space of salvation too. And he places that church right at the center of the novel and at the center of all the events that occur there. So yes.
Just speak Russian.
Yeah.
Okay, so I don't know if that's a question, more like a thought that I have. what you presented. I was in Stockholm a couple of years ago, and I visited the Vasa Museum. This is a ship, a warship, Vasa, that sunk in 1628. The museum was opened in 1990, and it's the most visited museum, not just in Sweden, but in whole Scandinavia. So do you consider that as a witness that the fascination of the modern man is evident that, you know, this is fully restored, taken out of that.
Yeah, I mean,
medieval
thank
ship.
you. It's an extraordinary example of that. I'll just give you one example in return, which is I went this fall to an exhibition at the British Museum that was the excavation of two Egyptian cities that were sitting right off the Nile and had become silted in, and they were covered by water. And nautical archaeology, which is a technology of diving, have really propelled this field since the 1990s. Discovered these ruins. They excavated them very laboriously. There are videos of, you know, the divers, archaeologists excavating them, and then you actually have the artifacts which were put in the museum, which were staged in a kind of penumbra that recalls the underwater realm. And the exhibition was wildly popular, and I saw people who had been back 2 or 3 times, you know, to look at these columns which once had been cities, which had then been submerged and which had now been excavated. So I think that would go along with, you know, what you're saying about the fascination. But I guess then the question is, well, what do we take from that? What, you know,
Was there some, was there was people from Swedish to
yeah.
It's a bit of a monument to hubris of that particular museum, isn't it? It's a very badly designed and overloaded with jewellery and
But about Egypt, we all know that the Nile is the generating factor in the whole civilization. So everything that concerns them, I guess, is not just the underwater aspect of it, but in general, that is Egyptian.
Also, yeah. I mean, this was also financed by BP, which I think was trying to, you know, assuage its conscience for the Deepwater Horizon. And I think there's, but I think this, you know, how do we take on climate change in the sense that our civilizations could one day be submerged like these civilizations, I think is a very, kind of to look into the future and to see what might happen to us is part of the allure of visiting these kind of sites.
So, as managing the network, yeah, you have to use the microphone because you are recording. So, for the benefit
That's it.
of, so
Yeah.